This is A World on Purpose.
A purposeful life is the most important kind and the most valuable kind of life.
Every choice that we make makes a difference, for better or worse.
I loved walking in a village and seeing the before and after.
This is the podcast dedicated to those humans choosing to live larger by working for the greater good. And these are their stories. Stories of hope and of true change that come from living on purpose.
What if you were to suddenly say there are no challenges, there are only opportunities?
Regardless of where you come from, your financial identity shouldn't determine where you end up in life.
I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris, and my hope is that my inspiring guests will take you on an introspective journey that helps you tap into your own pivot to purpose, bringing greater meaning to your life. Welcome to A World on Purpose. Hey everyone, and welcome again to A World on Purpose with me. You know who I am, your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris. Have you ever heard the term employee experience? If so, do you really know what that means? If not, then you're definitely going to want to tune in to today's episode with my epic guest and seasoned employee experience leader, Mr. Mark Levy. Over the years, Mark has been on the forefront of transforming the usual role of human resources beyond the benefits, salaries, and minimal requirements some companies think they need to meet in order to create a happy, engaged, and loyal employee environment. It has become much more than that, moving instead into what is now called, and what Mark has actually pioneered in huge companies like Levi's, The Gap, and Airbnb, as the employee experience. All the latest data shows that employees care less and less about salaries and benefits from the company they want to work for, and more about things like what does the company stand for from a values, purpose, and diversity standpoint. And further, what do they want to do to take care of their employees in a more meaningful way? They're looking to see how companies integrate programs that aren't just about their day job, but about something greater, and how they can engage in things outside their company in purposeful ways that ultimately drive and create a happy, positive culture inside the company as well as inside each employee. I met Mark a few years ago at the terrific Virgin Unite's 100% Human at Work ideation group that we're both involved in. When I learned the kind of innovative and powerful things that Mark designed in the employee experience space for all of his employees, including the measurable impact that those programs made on the lives of his employees, on the surrounding communities, and additionally to the bottom line of the companies where he led, I felt he needed to share those stories with you. If you own a company, be it large or small, established or young, or if you work inside a company and you all feel that you could do better by creating a more meaningful employee experience for your work family, Mark will not only enlighten you, but he will give you outside-the-box practical tools and ideas that you can try in order to create a better employee experience for your work family. So let's dive on in with Mr. Mark Levy. Hey, everybody. Good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It is me, your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris of A World on Purpose. And I'm here today, super thrilled to have my guest here with me today. He's somebody I met a few years ago at a very cool initiative I've talked a little bit about, ideation group called 100% Human at Work, which is a Virgin Unite, Richard Branson kind of Coolio thing going on. And I was just so impressed by what this man has done in his career for employee experience that I just had to interview him, because everything he does is around impact, whether it's internally for the company and then how that translates externally outside the company. So I'd like to welcome my guest. Before I go into his little bit of these awesome things he's done, my guest, Mr. Mark Levy. Mark, welcome to A World on Purpose.
Thank you for having me. I hope I can live up to your introduction.
Oh, you definitely can, for sure.
Right. Okay.
So I'm just going to touch a little bit about, before I go into that, why don't you tell everybody where you're broadcasting from? I like to do that because we're all so spread out these days.
Sure. I'm broadcasting live from my home office in Mill Valley, California, just over the Golden Gate Bridge. And I think we're one of the very few places right now in the country that's not frozen and lacking in electricity or water. So we're happy to be here with you, and I'm happy to be home.
Yeah, definitely. That's right. You're also right next to one of the world-class hiking spots of Mount Tamalpais, one of my favorite places to hike and love. Well, I'm just going to dive in a little bit for a second on some of the stuff you've done. So Mark, your background is really impressive as pretty much one of these. I love how you've described yourself as a seasoned, globally minded, experienced leader, employee experience leader. And what I love the most is what you said, you like to choose to work for big-hearted companies. I think that's really a unique value proposition of who you decided to engage with. And on that note, your career path has been everything from Best Buy to Levi Strauss and Company to the Gap Incorporated. And one of your last big endeavors, which is when I met you, was when you were the designing the employee experience at Airbnb, to which was such a great success for you and your team that you guys were recognized by Glassdoor as the #1 place to work in 2016. Some of the other cool stuff you've done, but I really want you to be able to talk about it in your words, which is my most favorite thing. So now you've kind of stepped out into this new pivot to purpose where you're kind of consulting with companies as this employee experience advisor, and you're working with Peloton, you're working with Everlane, you're working with Clio, which is a company that helps first-time parents with a broad range of support, and you're doing a lot of other cool things. We're going to talk about all of that and what you've done in the past. But before we do that, I love to really tap into this thing I call your pivot to purpose and kind of your origin story. And part of the goal of the show here is to give people insights to people like you, people like regular people who've done these wonderful things, who decided they wanted to leverage their career, their talents, their experience towards purpose. So, Mr. Mark Levy, without further ado, could you please share your origin story with us?
Sure. I guess I would say it probably started when I was going to summer camp in Hayward, Wisconsin. And it was a overnight camp, 8 weeks long. And they had something there called the Scholarship Fund. And the Scholarship Fund was someplace that they talked about a lot as we were growing up as a way to give in honor of a birthday, or it was a lot of Jewish kids, so it was for your bar mitzvah or whatever. And it really got us thinking early on around how to give back and how you could help those less fortunate. And that was probably the first place and time that I was really exposed to this idea of giving. And then in college, I went to Colorado College, which is a great liberal arts school nestled at the foot of Pikes Peak. And we took one class at a time rather than 4 or 5 a semester. It's called a block. And it was an amazing opportunity to do things really concentrated. And one block I ended up shadowing at the local district court. And through them, I got involved in volunteering at this place called Pikes Peak Legal Services, which provided really rudimentary legal services for those who couldn't afford a lawyer. And clearly I wasn't one yet, but it gave me an opportunity to really not just like donate money, but to donate my time and to work with people who were so appreciative of my trying to help them through issues as an employee or as a renter or whatever. And I think that really kind of started my juices flowing of how can I give back when I get into the workforce, and what can I do to influence the companies that I work for, and or how can I leverage the knowledge and experience I have to help those who can't necessarily afford it or are less fortunate.
Wow, that's very cool. I like that it touched you at such a young age too, which is often that most impressionable time, right? That can really kind of imprint you that way, which I think is lovely. So when you decided that you wanted to do that, and you knew that you wanted to do that kind of work, how did it translate then into becoming this, for in essence, culture, employee experience? How did that transition happen for you? Because you got into some pretty large companies, it seems, early in your career. Could you talk a little bit about what that was like for you and how you got in it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when I was at Best Buy, based in Minnesota, very back then kind of naive, very white, very conservative. And, they did a lot of donations to large charities, but it really wasn't very impactful on me, and it wasn't very deep, and you didn't really create a connection between donating and what it was that was the fruits of your donation or how you were helping others. I'd say when I went to work for Levi Strauss and Company, which is known for being on the forefront of really helping with the world's problems, whether it was AIDS, in the mid 1900s, later 1900s, or dealing with pollution and water or child labor or whatever. The Haas family was very, very focused on doing the right thing and leveraging their employees to be part of that. So at Levi Strauss & Company, we had a day in action every year that we all went out on the same day and volunteered in the communities in which we operated, and that happened globally. And then they also had a very active foundation called the Red Tab Foundation, and it was helping those who are less fortunate, both out in the world, but also our coworkers who needed help with whatever ended up coming their way that they couldn't afford, whether it was a medical issue of their parent or, a storm that, took down their house or whatever. So that's where I really saw that you could be profitable and purposeful, and that large companies played a role in how they created both empathetic and contributing employees, how those employees could use their skills and abilities to give back, and the connection between what the company did and how they showed up in the world, and how that created such strong engagement and pride. So one small example at Levi's was we had so many samples that ended up being made and not necessarily seeing the light of day because it was the wrong color or fabrication or size or whatever. And so we'd have these huge sample sales that happened once, maybe a quarter or so. And it turned out that everything that they made on the sample sales, and the prices were fairly low, but you felt okay paying for it because all the money went to charities that we chose to give back to. So that was super cool at Levi's. When I went to Gap Inc. down the street, the Fisher family was, I would say, even more involved because they were actually the chairman and chairpeople, John and Doris, of the Gap board, foundation board. And I happened to then recruit the head of Dockers, this amazing woman named Bobby Silton from Levi's, where she was the president of Dockers, over to Gap to be the head of the foundation, because they were looking for someone who was business minded, but also really big hearted and passionate. And she was just an amazing fit. But part of my deal was, I said, well, maybe this wasn't so appropriate, but I said, I'd love for you to come here, and I think you'll do really well. And I'd love if you do to put me on the board of directors of the foundation. So she came and I did. And so that was an amazing opportunity to get even closer, like to sit in these meetings and hear John and Doris talking about how they didn't really care about the notoriety they got for what they were doing, but they wanted to see the percentage of employees that were participating and the number of hours that people were volunteering. And those were metrics that were important to them more than how we were getting credit for the things that we were doing. And so that was really, really cool. And so some of the things, we created this kind of saying that was called "Be What's Possible," and we really encouraged people to get out and volunteer. And it was everyone from like part-time employees in our stores, to the leaders of the organization. And a few things that they did really well was that they recognized their volunteers through volunteering opportunities. So every year, you could submit to be part of the community corps. And if you won, and it was based on how much time you'd spent and the impact that you made, you could be part of community corps, and community corps each year got to go on a volunteer vacation. And so the one year that I got to lead that, part of the group, which I took, went to Guatemala, and the other part went to New Orleans after Katrina. And in both cases, we partnered with Habitat for Humanity, and we helped families to build homes. But it was unbelievable in the evenings when we would sit over meals and talk about what an incredible opportunity it was. around how proud people were of what they were encouraged to do and how they could give back to the things that were important to them, and how engaged they were to continue working for the company. And it just created this beautiful kind of ecosystem around employees, customers, and community. And I was so moved by that my wife Lindsay and I ended up donating a home on behalf of my parents' anniversary. And we went to Guatemala with our family, 3 kids, and another family who had 2 kids. And we ended up building a home in honor of my parents' anniversary with a family. And that was the most incredible experience. My kids were pretty young, in grade school, middle school, and they still say that it's their favorite vacation that they ever took.
Wow, that is so cool. That's like a real example of a tangible impact that the initiative made on you to then go do that even outside of the company requirement or company desire, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I love all of that. And I want to get a little bit deeper into some of that as we go through the show, but I'd love to backtrack just for a second and talk about, you talked about your origin story, where that came from, but how did you actually get into, it's not HR, it's a lot bigger than that. It's employee experience now. Define what that is for people so they understand the difference, and like what made you want to go there, and how have you seen the trends shift from when you first started and employees being not as engaged or companies not caring as much about them being engaged to where we are now with this being such a big sweeping thing in companies? Yeah,
that's a great question. I'll be completely honest, and I have to say that I was not proud to be in HR when I started in HR.
Sure.
They were seen as, this was like right after personnel, and they were seen as kind of the police or the people who you had to go to if you're going to get fired and you couldn't trust. And I took a very different approach, from the very beginning. And I always looked at HR as how can I help to unleash the talents of the people, and how can I understand the business and build relationships and add value that way. So I kind of started from the business and worked my way into how I could be successful, versus I had some managers who were like excited about writing the policy book and catching people do stuff wrong. And so I hate to say it, but I kind of learned by what I didn't want to be or what I didn't want to do, rather than kind of great role models.
Sure.
But when I worked for Levi's and I worked for Gap, and what I realized as well was that while they were companies that had presence around the world, I didn't necessarily feel like they were global companies, and they didn't really understand how to appreciate and create the intersectionality that needs to exist between a US company and an office in India or an office in the UK or Paris or wherever. And so I actually moved my family over to Paris for 2.5 years and worked for a very French company, which, to be honest, it was like same shit, different country, because they tended to be very ethnocentric as well. But what I learned was, because it was my first global experience, how you could listen and learn and be more open and understanding as you supported other parts of the world, and that neither of those ways that either country or companies were thinking about the world were the right ways. And so when I came back and I had the opportunity to start working at Airbnb, I interviewed with all 3 of the founders, Brian, Joe, and Nate, who are amazing human beings and have done great work in social impact, particularly now that they have some money. We could talk about that later. I remember Brian saying to me, I don't really know what HR is, but everything I've heard about it, I don't really like. So can we think about this in a different way? And so I said, absolutely. That just sounds amazing to me, because I'm not really proud to be calling myself an HR leader. And so he kind of told me about the different people in the company who were doing different roles that kind of were supporting employees, and they all reported to different people. And I basically said, let's bring them all together and let's create something new. And I said, you have a customer experience team that's focused on the customer. why not have an employee experience team that's focused on the employee? And if we treat our employees the way we want them to treat the customers, then everything will translate into through line.
Mm-hmm.
And was, privileged and so grateful for the opportunity I had there, both to have that permission to reinvent HR, but also to work for a company whose mission was to create a world where anyone could belong anywhere. And so our mission on the employee experience side was around creating a place where people felt like they belonged. Because if we could have our employees understand how we created belonging inside, then they could help our hosts understand how they could create belonging for the guests. And the big, I'd say, headlines for what EX is it's a mindset shift that basically says that we should do things with and for our employees, not to them. And not to create entitlement, but to involve them in the process and to move much more towards human-centered design or co-creation, because they're the ones who know what sucks about their job and how hard it is to deliver on the business goals and what they need. The HR team or the leaders are typically pretty far removed. And so when we made that mindset shift and ways of working shift to doing things with and for and co-creating, it just opened up a world of how you do a better job of prioritizing and how it's much easier to design what to do and how to do it when you have people involved that are in the thick of it, of doing it. And the last part about it is an organizational design, which is to broaden what HR is. So it included all the traditional HR functions, but it also included things like food, facilities, safety, security, environments, workplace, which were all things that typically sat in like real estate or facilities, which weren't looking at things through the lens of the customer or the employee. And then we also expanded to include an amazing group at Airbnb called Ground Control that is somewhat self-organized to focus on internal communications and the mission and values of the company. And in addition to that, we added wellness and social impact. And that's kind of what employee experience is. And I'm happy to say that it's now pretty commonplace that you'll hear employee experience as much as you would HR, and that it's meaning something much more impactful, much closer to the employee, and much broader in thinking than just the employee, but the employee, the customer, and the communities.
Honestly, that's just one of the most important pieces of information I think people can understand, because when you talk about your employees, instead of being treated like an expense, they're your greatest asset. And in order to keep them happy and healthy and well and retention and all those great things, you want them to feel like they're part of this experience. It makes sense. It's not a job, it's an experience. Right. So I think that you and the founders of Airbnb sort of not only laid out the example and the framework for that, but set the bar pretty high as well. And I want to get into some of the things that you guys did. That's a great place for us to take a quick break, because we're going to come back after you guys grab some water and breathe, like we like to say, on purpose. So we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back with Mark and kind of dive into some of the other cool things that he did at Airbnb and all the wonderful things that he is actually doing now and thoughts for the future. So we'll take a break and come right back with us. Okay, so hopefully everybody got some water and they're ready to get into the nitty gritty, I like to say, with our guest here, Mark Levy. And thanks for coming back with us, everyone. Mark, we were talking earlier about the definition of employee experience and how that's evolved and changed from what the typical dreaded HR, as you were saying. But it's a lot more than that too. That it seems what you were trying to talk about with your work at Airbnb, we were saying earlier how it sort of set the bar and also the example by which other companies can follow. I'd love for you to talk about how doing that with employee experience and engagement, how you were able to bring social impact into the company and how it's evolved since then, not just at Airbnb, but then we'll sort of go into some of the other things you've been working on since then.
Sure. So as I learned from my experiences at Levi's and Gap, the power of unleashing your employees to share what they do well and to be able to give back in ways that are meaningful to them was so important to create kind of the whole person. to create engagement and even to create that community between employees. For us, it was employees, guests, hosts, and the communities in which we operated. So initially, in my honeymoon period there, I tried to get a lot of things put through. And one thing that I was super proud of was a woman, Tori, and I were able to get the founders to agree to provide paid time off for volunteering. And we were able to get a pretty aggressive amount of time. So we were allowed to contribute 4 hours a month of paid volunteer time. And
that's a lot.
Then, yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah.
And what that enabled us to do was to then start to figure out how we're going to help our employees to figure out what they might want to do. And we did a lot of encouraging employees to volunteer together so that we could create connections between employees. We also encouraged our employees to volunteer with our hosts because we were trying to create connections with our hosts and really differentiate us from other kind of alternative accommodation providers. And then how to also make friends in the community. Because, I mean, there's a lot that Airbnb does quite well in the community, in that our hosts are basically micro entrepreneurs, and a lot of them are artists and designers and poets and musicians, or people that just can't make enough in their hourly work, and so they do host on the side. But they're also big-hearted people who are really excited to sometimes feel like they can visit another country without leaving their home by having folks from all over the world show up. And so it was really powerful to be able to let our folks get paid to work 4 hours a month. But it was so interesting how it then evolved. And what we ended up doing was putting a social impact champion in each of our offices, who then helped and encouraged employees to use their time to volunteer, but also helped to make the connections to the hosts and also helped to connect to nonprofits that were important to that city or country. And in some countries around the world, it's not as easy as it is in the US. Some of the socialist countries feel like, get out of my way, you're making us look bad kind of thing. So it went from the 4 hours a month to the social impact champions. And then more and more people wanted to figure out how we could incorporate social impact into other things. So for example, we ended up getting rid of the holiday party and instead did social impact volunteerism during the holidays. So whether it was adopt a family, or it was a team would go out and serve food in a shelter, or we would repaint a homeless or an elder care center, whatever it was. Again, really the hardest time for people is during the holidays, and we found a way to really shift our attention. And as we got bigger and we saw how much money we were spending on these holiday parties, we thought, this is ridiculous, let's spend it in a different way.
Really great.
We also shifted to our years of service program, ended up moving from stupid gifts of champagne or watches to actually giving everyone a Benevity account and then funding that account with certain dollar amounts. And it got bigger with every year that you were at the organization. Wow. We started a program called Recharge, which was, not sure if they're still doing it, but when I was there, people were tired, and anyone who'd been there 5 years, or when they got to their 5 years, got to take a month off with pay or 2 months at halftime. And a lot of what we tried to do was encourage people to consider how they could spend part of their time giving back when they were off on their recharge. So there's lots of ways that social impact got embedded into the organization. We also, actually, social impact moved out of employee experience into a separate organization led by Joe Gebbia, who's one of the 3 founders, who's super big-hearted and most notably was recognized for giving $25 million to San Francisco to try and help with the homeless issue.
Yes, he did.
And he was great in taking over social impact and started a lot of work around open homes, which was where we were working with our hosts to try and get them to open their homes when there was a disaster, whether it be a tornado or a hurricane or flooding. And then we combined that with our interest in creating a world where anyone could belong anywhere. And a lot of work was done around immigrants and opening your home to people when they arrived into a city. We did an interesting partnership with Cirque du Soleil, where they would go into a city and they were very unique and they needed places to stay. But we also ended up putting them in a way where they were able to hire some of the immigrants and also do some Airbnb experiences with the locals, and the money would go back to the charity. So lots of ways we thought about kind of doing this. There's one particular person that always comes to mind when I'm talking about this, named Florent, who is in the Paris office, and he was a social impact champion. And when they were kind of kicking around what they wanted to do there, they really focused on the immigrant situation, which was very large in Europe, and not enough attention was being provided there. And he ended up working with local hosts to get immigrants into their shared space in their homes. And he himself actually moved out of his home and lived with his parents and gave an immigrant his home, and also provided him with French lessons, because this person came from somewhere in the Middle East where he was actually a doctor, but didn't speak French and had to get certified in France to be a doctor. Well, he taught him French, and he actually lent him some money to go through medical school. And I'm happy to say now that this person's living on their own and is a doctor in France, speaks French well, obviously. And so just really beautiful stories like that started with just those, not just, but the beauty of giving our employees 4 hours a month to volunteer back in 2014.
Right. It's amazing how that small, what might seem small and might also be a scary endeavor for an employer to take on from a revenue perspective, has made such incredible, has touched so many lives with what you've done. And I would love to talk a little bit about too, not just about the impact outside the company that these initiatives have made, but really the impact on the employees, because that's something I think that's left out of the discussion a lot. I remember, we met through 100% Human at Work. And the reason I'm involved with that was because I was at this great impact conference, I don't even remember, 6 years ago. And there were a lot of speakers there. I think even Levi's was there. And so was Jean Allowang, the president of Virgin that we both know.
Yeah, she's awesome.
She's amazing. And I was listening to all of these companies talk about all the amazing impact they were making, clearly, with their supply chain and their communities and all these things. But the one topic that was left out of the equation was the impact they were making on the employees, the people inside their four walls. And so I raised my hand and I said, if people aren't thinking about social impact internally as much as they are externally, they're missing a piece of the puzzle. And that's how she and I connected, and then hence you and I. Could you talk about what kind of metrics? It's so hard to measure emotional currency, but what kind of benefits you found and the response you got from all these employees? Because when I came to visit you at Airbnb, it seemed like one of the happiest places I'd ever seen for people to work. And it must be huge emotional and probably other types of rewards on behalf of your employees.
Yeah. I'll tell you a little bit about what I saw firsthand, and then I'll tell you a little bit about research that I did. Because when I was asked to do a TEDx on the idea of giving back, they were looking for some data. So I did some research and found some. I would say what I found at Gap and Airbnb in particular is, first of all, the younger generations in particular are looking for a company that is mission driven. They're looking for a company that is connected to the community in an authentic way. And they're looking for a company that's going to support them giving back. So from an attraction standpoint, that is a huge benefit to the company. From a retention standpoint, I would say, when people ask how do we judge the benefits of employee experience, one of them is definitely around retention. But I also look at things like the number of volunteer hours that people donated, because those are also ways to further define how much someone is proud of the company and how much they're attached to the company and engaged to the company. So I'd say there's an attraction component, there's a retention component. And then what I saw and what the research also shared with me was that there is a very large percentage of employees, it was upwards of 90, I think, that said that it helped the employees to connect with other coworkers in ways that working with them hadn't. A second one was that it helped them to feel like they had purpose in their life. In addition to what the company was doing, it was company and self. And so I talk about this a lot because, I was so lucky to work for a company that's mission was around belonging, but there's a lot of companies that aren't that interesting or aren't that deep. But every company can give their employees an opportunity to give back, which will help them to find meaning in life because they're supported through their employer to do things that they otherwise wouldn't necessarily have time to do or the resources to do. And then the last thing that it talked about was the skills that they learned in giving back that translated into them doing their work better. And there was skills around collaboration and communication, and even around time management and project planning. All those things, depending on what you're doing when you're volunteering, were things that people learned how to do when they were volunteering and then brought back into the workplace. So I think all of those things together really sets out a number of ways that social impact and volunteerism can really help the company, the community, and the employee.
I think that's just so profound to me because, it just can easily be forgotten when you're talking about how you're building your teams and how you're managing your company. And so I'm really glad you mentioned that. And your TED Talk was great, by the way. It'll be on our website. So for anybody who wants to see Mark shine and do his thing and speak about these experiences, please go and watch that. It was very moving. And it's interesting too, because you guys sort of set the modern era of examples in the bar that have done this, but there have been thought leaders in the past too, like Yvonne Chouinard from Patagonia, who started this kind of stuff a long time ago, wrote a book called Let My People Go Surfing. I'd like to touch
my favorite book, by the way.
Me too. I've read it 100 times. I mean, I love it. And he said to me,
in fact, at Allbirds, we gave that book out to every new hire.
Oh, you did? Oh,
yeah.
Fantastic. What a great Bible. I think everybody who runs or owns a company must read that book.
Yeah.
And one of the things, I'm fortunate enough to know him through the years and was involved in 1% for the Planet, having met him many years ago in the 90s. And I did a paper. I became a corporate wellness coach. I don't know if you and I ever talked about this, but I wrote a paper about corporate wellness. And I want to talk just a little bit about wellness in a company too, because I think there's an impact and purpose angle to that in terms of taking care of yourself and giving people permission to do that. He had said to me that the money they spent on wellness was far less than they would ever spend on healthcare, and then yet their premiums stay low. Can you talk a little bit about wellness for us and inside Airbnb or anywhere else that you worked, and what that ended up being as meaning for the employees too?
Sure. Before I forget, though, you reminded me of a startup company that I'm working with right now called Goodera, Goodera. And they're helping companies, which particularly is helpful right now during the pandemic, to continue to do the volunteering that they were doing before, but remotely. And their approach is to help companies to find solid volunteering opportunities and to give people the opportunity to use their skills in helping those less fortunate. And also it's helping companies to keep their employees connected even during remote work, because there's some remote volunteering that they're able to provide that are group activities. So that's kind of a recent thing that I came across that are really being helpful right now. As far as wellness goes, I would say we came up with a strategy called growth by design. And it was, how do you help the company grow? How do you help the employees grow? And how do you help the culture grow? Part of growing the culture is a lot around this idea of social impact, because like I said, it connects you to the company, to each other, and to the community. On the employee part, we talked about learning and development. We talked about career trajectory, and we talked about what we called sustainable productivity. And that was both around ways of working and around taking care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is even more exacerbated and important with the remote working situation where boundaries are
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
non-existent. You used to say, well, I get to work from home. And now you say, I have to live at work because it's just one place right now. And so on the wellness side of things, I think it's critical for companies to help employees to understand how to create boundaries, how to take care of yourself, and how to, like at Airbnb, we did some great work where there was a lot of people who were into meditation, and we had a group that came together once a week, and for 30 minutes it was guided meditation, and we took turns every week who was doing that. We did bring in folks to teach yoga, or we had a lot of yoga teachers as well at the company. We did things like trying to encourage people to go out and go running at lunchtime, or to have different types of organizations after work that were playing soccer or tennis or whatever. But paying attention to people's, I would say, physical, mental, and emotional health. And mental health right now is also hugely critical, because you can, again, going back to the remote thing, you've got people that are in a studio apartment and they can't relate to anyone, and it's all through Zoom, and they're feeling isolated and lonely. And then you've got people that are either living with their family or with roommates, both of whom are getting on their nerves, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to work and live with all these people. And so, I think I agree 100% that spending your time and your money to help people stay healthy and to be proactive rather than dealing with high medical costs is really critical. And we talked about wanting people to be their best selves at work. I'm doing some work right now with Peloton, and their mission is around finding a way to use technology and fitness to help people become their best selves. That's for their members, but it's also for their team members and their employees. So I think, more and more there is an obligation for employers to figure out how you not just give someone meaningful work or make a ton of money or have high margins, but how you help your employees be their best selves, how you help them to contribute in the world, and how you can also help them to create great customer experiences.
I completely agree. And thank you for expounding on that, because I the pandemic definitely has shifted those boundaries. It's actually more dangerous, I think, in a way for people, because they don't know how to establish that, and bosses know they can reach people anytime because they know they're there. And I would love to take a real quick break, and when we come back, before we dive into all these wonderful new things that you're working on, which I'd love for you to share, I would like to talk a little bit about what you think, in your opinion, the future of work is, and how to maintain that culture and that employee experience when people might be working remotely for a while or indefinitely, because people are realizing, why do we need a big building full of employees now when we can run this way? So let's take a quick break. Everyone go get your water, take a deep breath, and we will come back with Mark Levy in 1 minute. Okay, we're back with my amazing guest, Mr. Mark Levy, and we were just talking about kind of the pandemic, and Mark, and the future of work. What's happening now, actually, the present time with people working remotely. You were talking about wellness and mental health and everything. I really want to tell people all the cool stuff you're actually working on now too. But before we do that, I would love to get your insights. I was saying earlier around, in your opinion, having done this for so many years and being inside companies in brick and mortar, with the pandemic affecting us the way it is and everything being remote, how do you see the future of work now with this boundary issue, with the loneliness, and with trying to maintain a culture and that employee experience? If companies decide they don't think they need a brick and mortar anymore.
Yeah, it's really on top of mind for me and a number of people that I work with. I guess the first thing I would say is I hope that I feel like the world needed to take a pause. I would never wish this upon us, with as many people that have died and all the challenges that are going on economically, etc. But I feel like between the pandemic and the George Floyd killing, there was people paying attention to things that we were ignoring, which was moving too fast and just the real challenge of systemic racial inequality. So my first hope is that we learn from what we've experienced and we apply what we learned as we go forward to think about the next iteration of this. Josh Person did a great white paper called The Big Reset. And I've been working with actually a guy named Aaron Harvey, who was my head of environments at Airbnb, who started a consultancy called Original Reality Group. And they've done amazing work around the workplace. And now the conversations we're having with each other and some other companies and HR leaders is around what is the future of work and workplace look like? And how do we move to a hybrid model where he said it really nicely yesterday, where he's talking about how rather than having an out-of-office message, you have an in-office message. And that when you're in office, it's very intentional, and it's around creating communications, it's around collaborating, it's around learning, and that there's no more going to a desk or an office just to sit there, but for making things happen and for what makes us feel better and be more productive as humans. And so I don't know what that's going to look like. I think there's a lot more flexibility now on where people live and not having to spend so much time commuting. But I still think there's a big role that the office or a workplace can play. And it just needs to be redesigned for much more intentional ways that people are coming together.
Okay, well, I think that that's actually absolutely perfect. My hope is that we do find that hybrid and that people are able to figure out. I mean, most of my career, I've worked remotely, and then I've worked inside of companies, and so for me, it wasn't that hard of a transition. But when you put something on top of it so monumental like this, and normally there is that work side, water cooler, places where you can go talk to somebody else about what's going on in your life or how things are feeling. And not having that is definitely difficult. And I think too, the technology, like with the Zoom fatigue and, all the things that people need to definitely still learn to have those tools to have that work-life balance that you talked about.
It's interesting because I feel like that the pandemic helped us to think through how to be more efficient with some of the technology. People saw immediately that email was overwhelming and that you could never find your way through it. And so I think Slack channels became a better way to bifurcate different topics. And I know initially during the pandemic, I was suggesting with some of the clients that I work with that they'd have a Slack channel on recipes and one on how to be a good teacher to your kids.
Great
and one
idea.
was how can you volunteer and give back, and even though you can't get out there anymore. So there was ways in which Slack was being used that way to help them keep work on email or work on work Slack channels. There's some interesting technology that's come out. There's one company I'm working with called Mixer, Mixr, that's helping to build trust and communities through technology. And so I like the fact that it's bred some really great ideas and some potential technology that will help us to evolve and transition to a hybrid model.
Oh, I love that. That's so cool. Those are really good ideas, actually, Slack channels for stuff like that. I think that's brilliant. What about too, the idea you were talking about of still trying to keep volunteerism happening even during the pandemic when we've got social distancing issues? What do you think about things like getting employees engaged to do online reading for kids and things like that? Or do you feel like that's a challenge, or would things like that be workable for people?
No, I don't think it's a challenge. I think it's hard for HR leaders right now to be thinking about a lot of these things. And this is kind of my frustration. They're in firefighting mode. And so some of these things like creating connections between employees other than getting work done. So how do you take some of the things where in real life and put them online? That's why I think this organization, this startup called Goodera, is an amazing solution to help HR leaders to get their employees to continue to volunteer online. And they make it super easy through either they do a couple things. One, I did one exercise where we were writing letters to elderly who were lonely in elder care centers. There's other ones they're doing for the blind, and they're taking books and they're having people record them. So there's more availability to listen, because since they can't read. There's also ways they're connecting people to do group stuff. But so I think it's important to continue, again, for the employee, for all the same reasons we talked about that make them feel like there's purpose in life, but also because there's so many more people right now that are homeless or that are indigent or that have lost their jobs and need skills and to learn skills, that we got to figure out a way to connect people to help those less fortunate, particularly if we all have more time, because we're not out doing the things we used to love to do because we can't do them, or, whatever.
Right.
So I'd say that's important. The other thing, which maybe you were going to get to, another kind of interesting and exciting project that I was working on.
Let's talk about the work you're working on now, because before we go out of time, I want to know about all these cool things.
So one thing that I'm super excited about, which is, I think it's a manifestation of building this social impact and giving back culture in an organization. So at Airbnb, like I said, we had a really generous amount of time that we were able to give back, and we did it with hosts, and we worked with immigrants and all sorts of, and a lot of marginalized communities. I could go on for so long about all that, but anyway, we built some really big-hearted people. And one initiative that I'm really proud of was there were a number of alumni who got together, and as the IPO was getting closer and closer, we realized that we were hopefully going to be in a position where our equity was worth something. It was a roller coaster rather than a rocket ship, for sure. And fortunately, when we went public, the stock significantly increased in value within 2 hours of going public. But there were some very big-hearted alumni that I was working with who started an initiative called Equity for Impact. And what they wanted to do, which was something that I actually had started to do with the folks when Airbnb was starting to do a .org or a foundation, was how do we re-engage our alumni to want to give back when we come into money and our equity can be liquidated. So this group of alumni started this Equity for Impact, and our goal was to try and get as many of our alumni and employees to commit and pledge to either a certain dollar amount or percentage of what they are going to make on the liquidity events, to pledge and give it back to nonprofits. And so right now, I just checked earlier, we're at close to 400 people and over $40 million in commitments.
You are kidding me.
No.
Oh my God.
And so it's super exciting to see how, because there is a bad reputation, and in many cases it's not wrong relative to tech and tech douchebags and
and
money hungry
racial
and all
injustice and sexual harassment.
But I can tell you that companies like Airbnb do not operate that way, and the employees that work there are so big-hearted. And so while we were trying to figure out when are we going public and what's going on with the taxes, there was a whole bunch of people that were figuring out what's the best way to give back. Is it with equity or with cash? And who's thinking about what? And Slack channels started on different ways in which we could give back and what nonprofits we could give back to. So this group of alumni started working with the Founders Pledge. We put together this thing called Equity for Impact. It's now really taken off. And now myself and a few others are working with the Founders Pledge to figure out how we can now market this to other companies that are about to go public.
Wow.
So that it's not an Airbnb initiative, but it's as many companies as will participate in getting their employees to do the same.
That's unbelievable. My God, I love that. And then how would you guys direct those funds? Do you have an advisory council where you decide that this money needs to go towards, specifically hiring marginalized people in marginalized community, reskilling people? Where does it? How do you guys see that being distributed?
So the $40 million is what individuals, these 400 people have said they would commit to giving back. The Equity for Impact has started some education. Founders Pledge also provides education. And now we're sharing information. It's basically kind of in pillars of, are you interested in climate change? Are you interested in elderly care? Are you interested in LGBTQ? Are you interested in marginalized homelessness, whatever? And then we're finding ways to share information and find nonprofits and or ways we can both donate money, but also our time to give back in more meaningful ways. So it's recreating community between the Airbnb employees and alumni around this idea of giving and the things that are important to us.
That's genius. I'm impressed.
Yeah, it's super powerful. And I think we were thinking, let's do this so that we can give back and share what we are getting. And we wanted to also figure out how we could set an example for others when they go. And so I'm happy to say that it's looking like that's kind of got some legs. I talked to a friend of mine, Woody Marshall, who's got a VC firm, and he's super excited about how he might bring this into his VC firm. So like there's different ways that we're trying to penetrate different ways in which companies are coming into money, and different ways that employees and alumni can give back.
Well, I think that's genius. And that just points to you now. You've taken this big step, kind of another pivot to purpose in a way in your life. We like to say pivot to purpose, leaving a big company and stepping out on your own. And now you are this consulting advisor, which is pretty amazing. And you've mentioned a few of the companies you're working with so far, but including even VC companies that are doing a lot of incredible stuff. Do you want to talk about a little bit about how you work now, in case anyone is out there thinking, wow, we really need to re-strategize, our employee experience and our culture? How does that work for you, and how do you help somebody?
Yeah, well, so I would say my next iteration I'm very excited about is to take what I've learned. It's taking the book actually back from the Fishers at Gap, and how do I leverage what I learned and know, and how do I help people who are in need with that? And so, but I also, I was super inspired in late 2013 as I was leaving Airbnb to have met a woman named Arlen Hamilton, who started a VC firm called Backstage Capital. And we were hosting her second year Backstage anniversary at Airbnb. We opened up our space to a lot of different nonprofits and companies and people that we loved that were doing great things. And since that time, Arlen's gone on to just be an incredible human being and to fund over 150 startups who are founded by what she calls underestimated founders. So they're
Love that.
BIPOC, women, or LGBTQ, or any combination thereof. And she started a couple of funds. She's done some accelerators in cities like Detroit and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and London. And really meaningful work that I've been doing with her and hope to do more of is how to provide resources and skills and connections to these founders who don't come from money and don't have the same connections as if they went to Stanford or Haas School of Business. And so that's kind of the exciting next, I think, pivot for me, is how to be able to help Arlen, marginalized, underestimated founders to think about the things that Brian, Joe, and Nate did before they started around mission and values and around, starting at a place of diversity and inclusion rather than something you try and jam in after you get larger.
Yep.
And trying to influence the larger VCs or private equity companies to be thinking about things earlier on, whether it's social impact or whether it's diversity and inclusion, as they're doling out money and setting these expectations of having a certain percentage of their founders be underestimated, or making sure there's an opportunity for social impact and volunteerism in the community from the beginnings, and kind of weaving that into their business model. I know Joe and Brian, when I talked to them and we introduced the 4 hours of paid time off, were kicking themselves in the butt, but they hadn't worked into their original back end that every time you stayed on an Airbnb, $1 went to a nonprofit.
Wow.
Just think about how many dollars would have been contributed at this point. But they're finding other ways to give back. So,
well, I think that's such a good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. I wanted to say that too, is, when you're starting a company, first of all, I love the idea of underestimated founders. I think that's a very cool term and apropos. But the idea that you can actually take the step to build this stuff in when you're first starting a company, as opposed to that fear mentality of, oh, we'll do that when we get bigger. We can't let go or do that now.
Yeah,
it is really important, because if you weave it into the fabric of your company early, it can make huge measurable impact internally and externally, right?
Yeah. I mean, look at Bombas and their socks.
I know. Bombas in their socks. That's funny. And didn't Arlen just, speaking about a founder with no resources, didn't she start that company when she was homeless? I think I'd read.
She was living on her mom's couch, and she was essentially without a home, and she learned all of this on her own, and really has created an incredible network, and really influenced VCs like Andreessen Horowitz and others to be thinking about how they dole out the funds that they're giving and try to create more equity amongst who's sitting in the top job in any company.
I love it. Well, Mark, we're getting close to the end here, and I'm so disappointed because there's so many more questions I want to ask you. But what I love to do towards the end of the show usually is kind of give people an insight into some of the challenges, that you experienced along the way in trying to lead this purpose-driven path, this impact path, especially inside established companies. And just kind of give people words of wisdom of what you might be able to share when they feel challenged and maybe like, oh, I can't do this, or this is too hard, or, I don't know if it'll succeed. Can you share a little bit about sort of what you did on your path when you ran into those situations? And
Sure. So a couple of things that I think we ran into is, I think I mentioned one earlier, that in certain countries, it's just not as easy to volunteer as in others, although every country has issues and challenges and people in need. So finding ways, creative ways to be able to contribute no matter where you are. And I don't think this should be just a US thing if you're a global company. The second thing would be how to commit to doing the same thing for an hourly workforce as an exempt workforce. Because I think they get just as much out of it. So it requires you, paying people, not just carving out part of someone's exempt salary to give back. The third thing would be being open to listen to what's important to your employees and or your customers. At Allbirds, we talked a lot about sustainability was our drive, and how to listen to the customers and what was important to them. And we actually were in process of trying to pair our store managers around the country with nonprofits in those cities that were focused on sustainability, and then become a place of education, a little bit like Patagonia is, to really create advocates around our customer base, particularly if you're a company that's doing something around something that's relative to social impact. I think another challenge is how to support the interests of your employees while also trying to create some sort of focus. I think the company really needs to figure out authentically what is it that you value and what is it that you're going to want to do in the world. And the company needs to have a focus, and you can do that as well as allowing your employees to give back to kind of more special interests. And then I guess I'd say, lastly, it's around how you kind of zooming out as a CEO or an HR leader or a company. You really think about your constituents more broadly than your customer and your investors and your employers, but you think about the community. And I think bigger hearted companies are thinking much more broadly like that.
I love that. I think you should hashtag bigger hearted companies. I think that's really sweet. Well, Mark, this has been so amazing. And I'm so happy everyone got to hear your journey and your story and all the incredible stuff. We didn't even touch on your work at Allbirds. That's another one. Your background is just awesome. And I'm certain that the lives that you've touched for the employees that worked for you and with you have probably been exponentially huge. I would love to give people the opportunity to find out where they can reach you and find you before we close out the show.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, probably the easiest thing is just find me on LinkedIn.
Great. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, and everybody, his Mark's bio, his LinkedIn profile, and also his TED Talk, which you must see, which is very cool, will be on the A World on Purpose website as well. And Mr. Mark Levy, thank you so much for giving me your time today. I'm super excited that you came here and shared all of that with us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing what you do. It's helping a lot of people to share their ideas and a lot of people to learn what they can do and have more of an impact.
Thank you. I hope that's what we do at A World on Purpose. We're trying to create a community of people that are living with that intention of living in the world on purpose, with purpose, and for purpose. And so thank you everyone for tuning in. You know, I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher Harris. We are so happy to have you here every week. Please keep coming back. And we'll have great guests every week for you that inspire you to find your own pivot to purpose. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you for taking this journey into a world on purpose with our incredible guests. To learn more about our amazing guests and their inspiring purpose-driven work, please go to aworldonpurpose.com. Don't forget to look at our call to action of the week to mobilize your desire for purpose into action. A World on Purpose can be found on Apple Podcasts and all the major podcast platforms, and the video version can be found on YouTube. If what you heard today inspires you, please write a review and like and share on the platform of your choice. We'd love to also hear from you and learn your pivot to purpose and the meaningful work that you do that lifts humanity. Send your stories to info@aworldonpurpose.com. I'd like to thank our World on Purpose team for making this show a reality. Once again, I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher Harris. Thank you for tuning in to A World on Purpose. I look forward to seeing you soon.